Hey guys, tonight's journey takes us somewhere quietly fascinating, a place where time itself was still learning to tick. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let the hum of the present fade away. Tonight, we drift back more than 4,000 years to the sun-bleached banks of the Nile, where the first civilizations tried something that would change human life forever: measuring time and learning how to wake up on purpose. This is a story about the first alarm clocks, not made of gears or glass, but of water, fire, and patience. It's early morning in Thebes around 1400 BCE. The desert air is cool, heavy with the scent of river reeds. Somewhere in the temple complex, a priest yawns quietly and leans over a stone basin filled with water. You can picture it, a perfectly still pool, about the size of a large bowl, its surface marked with faint rings and little carved numbers. Every few moments a droplet of water slips through a tiny hole in the bottom, softly, almost like the beat of a slow, sleepy heart. This was a clepsydra, the Egyptian water clock, a vessel that did one thing astonishingly well: it let time leak away. The priests of Amun-Ra didn't have watches or sand timers. What they had instead was silence, darkness, and this patient device. Each drop marked the slow march of night. Each carved line told them how long until the first light of dawn. You see, for the ancient Egyptians, time wasn't a mechanical concept. It was a sacred rhythm. The stars moved because the gods allowed them to move. The Nile flooded because the heavens decreed it, and even the slow drip of water was a divine whisper, a reminder that every moment belonged to the gods. The temple priests had a duty that made these clocks essential. They had to recite hymns, burn incense, and perform rituals at precise hours through the night, even when the world was still asleep. But in a time before bells, before clocks, before any sense of 9 p.m. or 3 a.m., how could they possibly know when to wake? That's where the water came in. The simplest Egyptian clepsydra was nothing more than a stone bowl, often made of alabaster or bronze, shaped like a wide pot with sloping sides. Artisans carved marks along the inner walls, carefully spaced, each one corresponding to a fixed interval of time. As the water slowly drained, the level dropped from one mark to the next. It sounds primitive, but it worked. Each hour of the night could be measured by the descent of the water's surface. And with that, the priests could tell, almost to the minute, when it was time to begin the next chant. These clocks weren't just tools. They were sacred instruments. The flow of water represented the eternal flow of life. The stillness of the temple mirrored the stillness of the night. And the act of watching time, drop by drop, was a kind of meditation in itself. Imagine it now. You, standing in the cool temple corridors, the faint glow of oil lamps flickering against carved stone walls. The water clock sits in a corner, silent except for its gentle dripping. Outside, the Nile slides through the darkness. No one speaks. No one rushes, each drop a heartbeat. Each drop a prayer. The priests didn't just measure time, they communed with it. They believed that by tracking the passage of hours, they were tracking the heartbeat of the cosmos. But as the centuries passed, something began to change. The Egyptians noticed that the water clock wasn't perfect. On colder nights, the flow slowed. On hotter nights, it quickened. Some clocks leaked too much, others too little. And the priests, relying on the steady drip to guide their sacred duties, found themselves sometimes waking too soon. Or too late. There's something strangely human in that. Even 3,000 years ago, people struggled to wake up on time. And so, quietly in the corners of Egyptian workshops, artisans began to experiment. They carved new shapes, narrower holes, deeper bowls. They began inscribing hours not in water height, but in time intervals. They turned clockmaking into both science and art. But the most remarkable change came not from the priests, but from those who worked the night watch. Because while the temples prayed, the workers of the city, the guards, the builders, the night boatmen also needed to keep track of time. And unlike the priests, they didn't have access to temple clocks, so they built their own. Small, crude bowls, sometimes even broken jars patched with pitch, filled with Nile water and left under the moonlight. They learned that by counting drops they could measure hours. By marking when the flow ended, they knew when dawn would come. This wasn't divine science anymore. This was human timekeeping. The slow, stubborn attempt to make order out of the chaos of sleep, and yet, as these humble water clocks spread from temples to homes, a quiet question began to echo through the ancient world. Could time itself be controlled? Could a simple bowl of dripping water, something as natural as the river itself, truly wake a person up? That question would spark one of the earliest human obsessions, the pursuit of mechanical precision, a pursuit that would lead, centuries later, to candles that burned in measured lengths, to gears that ticked with iron rhythm, and to the first true alarm. But before any of that could happen, someone had to listen to the water long enough to realize it was the Temple of Karnak did not sleep. Even when the city outside lay wrapped in silence, its walls hummed with the faint rhythm of footsteps and whispered prayers. Somewhere within those long colonnades, the water clock continued its soft dripping, marking not just the hours but the devotion of the night. The priests of Amun-Ra believed that their duties were bound to the cycles of the heavens. Every chant, every lighting of incense, every offering of bread had to be performed at a precise moment. For to mistime a ritual was to risk imbalance in the universe itself. And so, long before the world had hours or calendars as we know them, these guardians of sacred order built their lives around the patient flow of water. It's a strange thought. The first true timekeepers were not engineers but worshippers. And their laboratories were not workshops but temples. To them, time was not linear. It was cyclical, like the flooding of the Nile or the path of the sun across the sky. When the river rose, so did the fields. When it fell, so did the crops. Everything was born, lived, and died in rhythm. The clepsydra, with its endlessly dripping flow, was the perfect symbol of that belief. But behind the sacred veneer there was another story, the quiet genius of craftsmanship. Egyptian artisans took extraordinary care to perfect the water clock's design. They learned how the diameter of a hole could alter the flow by fractions of a heartbeat. They shaped the inner curve of the bowl to ensure that the level fell evenly. They carved notches for the hours of the night, not 12, as we might expect, but sometimes 24, or even 12 per season, since the length of night changed throughout the year. In other words, they didn't just build time, they adapted it to the rhythm of nature. A fragment of one such clock was found in the ruins of Karnak, a piece of limestone worn smooth by centuries of hands. It bears the faint traces of hieroglyphs marking the hours, and a small, almost imperceptible hole drilled near the base. To hold that fragment is to hold a whisper of human patience, an ancient attempt to measure what cannot be touched. But while the temple clocks remained silent in their stone chambers, outside in the bustling markets of Thebes and Memphis, a different rhythm was emerging. The merchants needed time to manage their trades, the bakers to time the rise of their bread, and the ferrymen to catch the tide at dawn. Suddenly, timekeeping was no longer just divine. It was practical. The Egyptians began crafting smaller versions of the water clock. Some were portable, made of bronze or terracotta, with markings etched along the inside for day and night. Others, more elaborate, were shaped like miniature shrines, tiny altars to time itself. For the first time in human history, time had entered the household. One can imagine a family gathering at night, watching the slow descent of water through a small vessel, knowing that when the bowl was empty, it would be time to prepare for dawn. There was something comforting about it. The predictability, the calm, the sense of control over the endless dark. And yet, this new familiarity bred an odd unease. If time could be measured, could it also be owned? If a man could watch the night slip away drop by drop, did he also lose something in the watching? It's a question as old as the first clock, the uneasy tension between mastery and surrender, between controlling time and being controlled by it. Back within the temple walls, the priests faced their own challenge. Their clepsydras worked well enough during the quiet nights of winter, but in the heat of summer, the water evaporated faster than expected. The flow changed. The marks no longer matched the stars. Rituals began to drift out of sync with celestial events. It was a crisis, not of faith, but of precision. To correct it, temple scholars began recording astronomical data, aligning the movement of the stars with the rate of water flow. They discovered that even small temperature shifts could affect timing by minutes. And so they began to chart the sky, not for prophecy, but for calibration. What began as a simple dripping bowl had now become a scientific instrument. The first experiments in regulated timekeeping had begun. In those dim corridors, you can almost hear the beginnings of something revolutionary. The quiet birth of accuracy, of standardization. Without fanfare, without celebration, humanity was learning to divide its life into measurable pieces. And yet, the clock itself remained utterly still, its purpose unchanged, to remind the living that time flows. Regardless of who measures it, the priest refills the basin. The water shivers under lamplight. He glances once at the descending level, then returns to his chants. Outside, the sky begins to pale with the first color of morning. The night has ended exactly on schedule. But even as Egypt perfected its sacred clocks, word of this strange invention began to travel. Across deserts, through caravans, and overseas. Other civilizations listened, observed, and improved. The Greeks would soon tinker with the design, adding gears and dials. The Romans would use them to regulate courts and speeches. And somewhere far to the east, another people would discover that fire, not water, could measure the night just as faithfully. The world, it seemed, had started to count. But before the sound of ticking and ringing filled human life, the idea of the alarm still waited in silence. How did we go from watching time to being woken by it? That story begins not with water. Morning in Thebes arrived not with noise, but with color. The horizon flushed pale gold as the Nile glittered like a ribbon of molten light. Boats creaked, farmers stirred, and the air filled with the quiet rhythmic sounds of a city finding its breath again. Inside the temple, the water clock stood empty. A single drop clung to the rim before it fell, making a faint sound like a heartbeat ending its count. The priest refilled the vessel as he always did, and for a moment, time began again. That small act, pouring water into stone, was as close as the ancient world ever came to resetting the day. But there was a problem that lingered like the echo of that final drop. Who woke the priest to refill it? This was the paradox of timekeeping in a world still ruled by sleep. Clocks could measure the night, but they could not command it. They could whisper time's passing, but they could not call the living to action. The Egyptian priest, like the ferryman and the guard, still depended on instinct, on the body's own uncertain rhythm to rise, and so the Egyptians began to search for something new, a device that could not just measure time, but announce it. At first, this was simple. Some temples stationed young apprentices whose task was to sit by the clepsydra and watch. When the water reached a certain line, the apprentice would strike a small gong or blow a reed horn. These were the first human alarms, A sound to wake, a call to act. The beginning of what would one day become humanity's least favorite sound, the alarm clock. But the Egyptians, ever clever, didn't stop there. Some early texts describe water clocks with small mechanical features, a figure of a man that would rise or a small door that opened when the water reached a certain point. We can't say for certain how these worked, but fragments and descriptions suggest they used floating markers that lifted as the water level dropped. When the float reached the top, it might release a bead, strike a small bell, or tip a lever. It was simple physics, gravity, balance, and flow used for something profoundly human, to keep someone from oversleeping. Imagine that scene. A chamber deep in a temple, a clock dripping through the night, and at the first light of dawn a delicate click, a soft chime, a sound so small that only the listening priest would hear it, but enough to tell him the sun had returned. This was the ancient world's first alarm. No gears, no hands, just water, silence, and anticipation. But like all inventions, it carried a deeper meaning. It represented humanity's first attempt to bind sleep to schedule. For tens of thousands of years, people had lived by natural rhythms: the sun, the moon, hunger, fatigue. Now, for the first time, they were shaping those rhythms to their will. It was the dawn not just of timekeeping, but of discipline. The priests of Amun-Ra became the earliest workers bound to a timetable. And with that, something subtle but irreversible changed in the human story. The idea that time was not only something to observe, but something to obey. Outside the temple, the rhythm of life mirrored this new awareness. Merchants began to open their stalls at regular hours. Builders began shifts that aligned with daylight. Even the Nile ferrymen who once departed when the stars said so now learned to watch the dripping bowl. The city of Thebes began to breathe in hours. It's easy to overlook how quietly revolutionary that was. There was no proclamation, no discovery day carved in stone, but that subtle rhythm, the soft counting of hours, would ripple through history, touching every civilization that followed. Centuries later, when Greek scholars studied Egyptian clocks, they borrowed the idea and refined it. Ctesibius of Alexandria, a curious inventor from the 3rd century BCE, added gears, floats, and even sound effects to his water clocks. Some of his devices released a pebble that rang a gong when the hour changed. Others used tiny mechanical figurines that moved automatically with the flow of water. From there, time began to transform into something visible, audible, and measurable. Egypt had given the world the pulse of water. The Greeks turned it into the language of machinery, but the seed had been planted long before. In those quiet nights by the Nile, where the first drop fell into the first bowl, and someone realized that waiting could be measured. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear that ancient dripping still echoing beneath every modern alarm. Every time your phone buzzes in the morning, every time a clock strikes the hour, it's the same rhythm, the same heartbeat of civilization repeating across thousands of years. The whispering water clocks of Egypt may have long since fallen silent, their bowls broken, their temples faded into sand, but the sound they taught the world to hear, the sound of passing time, has never truly stopped. And so, as the Nile flows on, and the world continues to chase the seconds it once simply watched, one can't help but wonder if night had a scent in ancient China, a mixture of soot, sandalwood, and melted wax. It drifted through corridors of bamboo and stone, curling into the corners of sleeping rooms, marking the slow, invisible journey of time itself. While Egypt's priests listened to the drip of water, the Chinese watched flame and smoke. They didn't measure time by what fell, but by what vanished. The candle clock. A fragile, flickering, almost poetic invention, the simplest of devices, and yet for centuries, one of humanity's most faithful keepers of time. Long before mechanical clocks or watches, the Chinese understood that the burning of a candle could be predictable. If a certain kind of wax burned a certain distance per hour, then each mark along its length could represent an hour of the night. It sounds mundane now, but to the people of the Tang and Song dynasties, this was nothing short of practical magic. A single candle could tell you when to rise, when to pray, when to begin a journey, and when to end a long day's work. It was time you could touch, warm, glowing and alive. Imagine a scholar in the city of Kaifeng, sometime around the 10th century. His study is quiet except for the crackle of the wick. The candle before him is tall, divided by delicate ink lines, one for each hour of the night. A bronze holder catches the melting wax in a small dish. On the desk lie scrolls, brushes, and a cup of tea gone cold. He writes until the first mark disappears into the flame, and then the next, and the next. The candle shrinks. The night passes. This was how poets, bureaucrats, and monks counted time, by watching the slow, steady consumption of light. The candle didn't just mark hours. It measured patience, thought, and endurance. In its soft light, the night itself seemed to have structure. But there was a problem. Candles were too quiet. They told you time had passed but not when it was time to wake. And so as early as the 9th century, inventors began to modify the design. They pressed small metal balls or weights into the wax at hourly intervals. As the candle melted, the metal pieces dropped into a tray below, creating a soft chime, a sound delicate enough not to startle, yet clear enough to rouse a sleeping scholar or servant. That small plink in the dark was the ancestor of the modern alarm. No gears, no electricity, just wax, heat, and gravity. It's strangely elegant, a candle that announced its own death, 1 hour at a time. The beauty of the candle clock lay in its impermanence. It didn't preserve time. It consumed itself to display it. The act of burning was the act of counting. Every moment was quite literally burned away. Perhaps that's why so many ancient Chinese writings treat candles as metaphors for life itself. "The candle weeps," wrote one poet, "and its tears are the hours it loses." There's something quietly haunting about that image, so reminder that the light which guides us also disappears because of its guidance. But the candle was only one half of the story. In monasteries and palaces, another device glowed softly in the dark, the incense clock. Instead of burning upward, it burned sideways, thin trails of scented powder arranged in long paths or coils. Each fragrance marked a different period: sandalwood for dawn, aloes wood for evening, musk for the deepest part of night. As the incense burned, it would reach threads strung across its path. Each thread held a small weight that, when burned through, fell into a metal bowl with a gentle ding. This was not merely timekeeping. It was ritual. The hours were scented, sounded, and sanctified. Unlike the Egyptian water clock, which whispered in drops, the Chinese clocks whispered in smoke. They turned time into air, into fragrance, into something that could only be experienced, never possessed. It's easy to see why emperors and monks alike loved these devices. They combined practicality with poetry, discipline with beauty. And they fit perfectly into a worldview where harmony mattered more than precision. In the Chinese conception of time, to live well was not to chase the hour, but to move with it, to exist within its gentle rhythm. The incense clock didn't count seconds. It breathed. Still, as China's cities grew busier and life became more structured, people began to rely more on schedules, court sessions, examinations, market hours. The candle and incense clocks evolved accordingly. Some were built into ornate bronze frames. Others were mounted on gimbals to stay level on ships. A few were even connected to mechanical devices, early gears, water-driven spindles, and simple automatons that struck bells. By the 11th century, Susong's great astronomical clock tower would rise in Kaifeng, a vast water-powered marvel that could ring bells, move figures, and display the stars. But at its heart, the principle was the same as the candles. Time flows by consuming something precious, and so in the soft glow of night, the scholar lifts his brush once more. The candle has burned halfway down. The scent of sandalwood curls toward the rafters. Outside, the city sleeps, but the candle keeps watch, a silent guardian of passing hours. The scholar pauses, listening to the faint sound of a bead falling into its tray. He sighs, dips his brush, and writes another line. He doesn't know it, but that small sound, that simple plink, is history's first alarm ringing softly through the centuries. But even the gentlest light can cast a long shadow. As the candle clock spread across Asia, another culture took its inspiration in an entirely different direction. One far louder, sharper, and more mechanical. Because while the Chinese measured time through fragrance and flame, the medieval Europeans were about to give time a new voice, one that could shake an entire city awake. The candle has burned low. A thin thread of smoke curls from its dying wick. But not far away in a temple high above the city, another clock is just beginning to breathe. It is late in the Tang dynasty, somewhere around the 8th century. The monastery is quiet except for the sound of wind passing over tiled roofs. Inside, a monk in gray robes kneels before an incense burner. The air is cool, the lamps faint. He holds a long stick of scented powder, about the length of his arm, and gently presses it into the grooves of a carved bronze tray. The tray is covered in intricate winding channels, each one filled with fine incense powder mixed with herbs and crushed wood. He lights one end with a glowing ember. The tip flares, then settles into a calm red point. And just like that, time begins to move. Each breath of smoke is a minute, each thread of ash an hour. As the incense burns along its path, it releases subtle waves of fragrance. Amber at first, then a faint hint of camphor, then something sweeter, deeper, like dried petals and resin. The monks call it the Path of Hours. To the untrained eye, it looks like art. To those who keep watch through the night, it is a quiet calendar of devotion. Every time the incense reaches a crossing point, a thin silk thread is burned through. The thread releases a tiny metal ball or weight, which falls into a small bowl with a soft chime. The monk bows slightly at each sound. A new prayer begins. The smoke continues its journey. It's difficult to overstate the elegance of this invention. It required no water, no maintenance, no noise, only balance, patience, and fragrance. Even more remarkable, incense clocks could measure different intervals by changing the pattern of their paths or the composition of the powder. A tightly packed trail burned longer. A loose trail burned faster. Some were coiled for 12 hours, others for 24. In this way, the incense clock became an object of both science and beauty, a spiritual companion that marked time through scent instead of sound. As the centuries passed, these clocks evolved into breathtaking works of craftsmanship. Artisans carved clock trays from jade, ivory, or fine bronze. In wealthier homes, the channels were inlaid with gold or silver, each path representing not just hours, but moods: dawn scented with sandalwood, dusk with agar wood, midnight with ambergris or musk. Some even had tiny mechanical attachments, dragons whose eyes glowed with hidden embers, phoenixes that released thin trails of smoke from their beaks, cranes that bowed their necks as the incense reached their perch. These weren't merely clocks. They were performances of time, but the real brilliance of the incense clock wasn't visual, it was sensory. Time became something you could smell. For those living in the pre-mechanical world, this was more than convenience. It was philosophy. The passing of time was gentle, fragrant, dissolving into the air. It reminded people that life itself was transient, that moments like smoke rise and vanish, leaving only traces of their scent behind. It was a way of aligning the spirit with impermanence. To measure time was not to fight it, but to accept it. And yet, like all good ideas, the incense clock eventually stepped beyond the monastery walls. Merchants in Hangzhou began to use simplified versions, straight sticks of measured incense, that burned for an hour or two, sold at markets and used in workshops, kitchens, and boats. A blacksmith could burn one stick while forging metal. When the scent changed, it meant his hour of labor was done. A silk dyer could mark each stage of color by the length of an incense burn. Even families used them during festivals, lighting, coils that burned for an entire night, their homes perfumed until dawn. Time for the first time had entered every corner of daily life, not through ticking or ringing, but through something as soft as smoke. But there was one more step. One more small leap in the story of these burning clocks that would transform them from gentle companions into tools of precision. Sometime during the Song Dynasty, craftsmen began to combine the two traditions, candles and incense. They built hybrid clocks, candles with hidden threads of incense inside, so that as the wax melted, fragrance filled the room at hourly intervals. It was an ingenious marriage of the senses. Light to see the hour, scent to feel it, and sound when the metal beads dropped. A threefold reminder that the day was passing, that nothing, not flame, not fragrance, not man, could hold still forever. In a way, these clocks captured the entire philosophy of Chinese timekeeping. Where the Egyptians sought accuracy and control, the Chinese sought harmony and awareness. Their clocks didn't fight the flow of time. They drifted with it. Each hour arrived as a note in a larger melody. Each sent a verse in the quiet poem of the day. But the fragrance of hours would soon carry beyond China's borders. Through trade routes and embassies, the idea of burning time, literally, found its way west. To the courts of Persia, to the scholars of Arabia, and eventually to the restless, noisy streets of medieval Europe. There time would lose its perfume and gain something else entirely. Sound, the bells of cities, the clanging of gears, the call to prayer, all would emerge from this soft lineage of smoke and flame. But before that clangorous chapter begins, one question lingers, hanging in the perfumed air of the monastery. When time smells this sweet, morning light touches the tiles of the monastery roof. What was once smoke is now a trail of ash. The incense clock, quiet and still, has completed its path. A monk brushes the cooled ash into a small ceramic bowl, a ritual of closure, soft and unhurried. The bowl is then stored carefully on a shelf. Each layer of ash marks another night, another meditation, another passage of time. These ashes are not discarded. They are kept, the dust of time itself. By the late Song Dynasty, these fragrant instruments of time had spread across China, from grand temples to scholars' studies, from the palaces of Hangzhou to the small tea houses near the river. In the capital, merchants sold measured sticks of incense in bundles, each marked with red dots for 15-minute intervals, others shaped into spirals that could burn through an entire night. Everywhere, People were marking their days not by clocks or calendars, but by the soft passing of scent. Time had become something felt, not counted. But history, as it often does, was changing. The 11th and 12th centuries brought something new, an age of engineering and curiosity. The Chinese had already given the world paper, printing, and gunpowder. Now they were beginning to dream of machines that could think, that could move, that could keep perfect time. In Kaifeng, the capital of the northern Song, there lived an official named Susong. He was an astronomer, engineer and bureaucrat, a man equally at home with ink, metal, and stars. Susong had studied the ancient water clocks of the past, and he was fascinated by the monks' incense clocks too. He imagined something greater, a clock that combined the precision of water with the philosophy of smoke, a machine that would never sleep. And so, around the year 1090, Susong built the cosmic engine, a towering water-powered astronomical clock nearly 30 feet high. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen. At its heart was a great water wheel that turned continuously, regulated by a chain drive and escapement system. Centuries before Europe would rediscover the same idea. As the wheel turned, it powered an armillary sphere above, showing the movements of the stars and planets, while mechanical figures emerged from small doors, ringing bells to mark the hours. Imagine it, a living tower of metal, wood, and water, breathing rhythm into the city, bells chiming, drums beating, stars moving in silent harmony. This was the moment when time itself stepped from the realm of scent and flame into the world of machines. And yet, Susong's masterpiece did not last. When invading armies from the north captured Kaifeng, the cosmic engine was dismantled, its parts lost or melted down. The great water clock disappeared into history, a legend of precision swallowed by chaos, but the memory of it lingered. And so did the gentler clocks that inspired it, the candles, the incense, the fragrant dust that once marked the flow of hours. In the centuries that followed, as trade expanded along the Silk Road, the idea of measuring time through fire and scent traveled westward. Arabic scholars studied the ancient Chinese techniques, adapting incense burners and water clocks for their own observatories. By the 13th century, European monks were experimenting with mechanical bells and escapements, paving the way for the tower clocks that would soon dominate every cathedral and city square. The sound of time was changing, from silent smoke to ringing metal, from meditation to urgency, from fragrance to echo. And somewhere centuries later, in a quiet Chinese temple that escaped the fires of war, an old monk would still light a stick of incense at dawn. He would watch the first curl of smoke rise, and perhaps he would think, as Susong once did, that even the greatest machines were only imitations of this. A quiet, burning measure of lifetime, after all, was never meant to be captured. It was meant to be noticed, to be breathed in and then gently let go. So the incense burns, the smoke drifts, and the world turns once more. Each breath, each flame, each fading scent, a small reminder that even the most boring inventions can change the rhythm of the world. And as the last ember glows, one question remains in the silence. If time itself can vanish into smoke, what do we really keep? The hour that passed or the fragrance it left behind? Before ships crossed oceans and wheels spun on engines, the world moved at the pace of hooves, sandals, and breath. For thousands of years, the most powerful force shaping history was not war or invention, but roads. Not the grand kind with marble edges or royal arches, but dusty, endless paths that curled through deserts, cut through forests, and climbed mountains in silence. The story of roads is, in many ways, the story of patience, because everything, from empire to bread, depended on how far a person could walk before nightfall. Picture the world in slow motion. The Roman Empire stretches across the Mediterranean. Persia hums quietly to the east. In China, the Han Dynasty rises, and between them lies an ocean of land, the silent corridors of trade that we would later call the Silk Road. But before there were merchants and silk, before there were names and maps, there were simply paths, footpaths worn by animals and hunters, then by farmers carrying baskets of grain, then by traders with clay jars full of salt. Every step laid a future stone of empire. The earliest known highways weren't paved or planned. They were survival routes, narrow strips of bare earth flattened by repetition. A good road wasn't beautiful. It was reliable, a place where rain didn't pool, where dust didn't swallow the feet, where a cart could pass without breaking its wheel. So ancient people learned to follow the logic of the land. They let rivers lead them, chose valleys that curved gently, and climbed ridges that offered wind and safety. Every road was a compromise between distance and endurance. By around 2000 BCE, the first known road engineers appeared in Mesopotamia. They built straight lines of crushed stone and clay, sometimes covering them with bitumen, a primitive asphalt that made travel smoother for wooden carts. In the hot air of Sumer, these roads connected temples, markets, and cities. The road from Ur to Uruk was only about 150 miles long, but it was enough to create one of the first true trade networks. The Sumerians didn't build for glory, they built for movement. Every cart that rolled across those roads carried more than goods. It carried ideas. A few centuries later, the Persians took the idea further. When Darius III came to power around 500 BCE, he understood something profound. A kingdom is only as strong as its messages. So he ordered the construction of what became one of the most remarkable infrastructures of the ancient world, the Royal Road. It stretched nearly 2,700 kilometers, from Sardis near the Aegean Sea to Susa in the Persian heartland. A courier could ride its length in just 7 days, a miracle of logistics for the time. Ordinary travelers needed 90. Along the road, the Persians built relay stations every few miles, simple stone posts where horses and riders could rest and change. It was in essence the first postal service. Messages that once took months now arrived in a week. Orders moved faster than rebellions. Empires could think and react across vast distances, and all because someone decided that a road should not just lead somewhere, it should connect everything. Travelers along the Royal Road described its beauty in strange ways. It was not scenic. It was orderly, predictable. A flat scar through deserts, forests, and plains. Camps smelled of smoke and sweat. The night air filled with the distant howls of jackals, and yet it was civilization made visible. For the first time, time itself could be measured by distance. People spoke of how many days the road took, not in hours or miles. And that is perhaps the most forgotten idea of all. For most of history, a day was a measure of walking. By the time Alexander the Great crossed Persia, the Royal Road was already a legend and a strategic gift. His armies marched along it like blood through a vein, using the same stations, drinking from the same wells built centuries earlier. And when Rome later rose, it borrowed not just Persian administration, but Persian road-building philosophy. Because the Romans and those meticulous engineers understood one great truth. If you can control the road, you can control the world. And so for the next 500 years, the earth itself would be reshaped by Roman stone, roads stretching from Spain to Syria, laid with gravel, crushed lime, and interlocking slabs, still visible today beneath modern asphalt. They were built not just for armies, but for grain, messages, and taxes. Every road had milestones marking the emperor's name, quiet propaganda under travelers' feet. And for the Romans, as for the Persians before them, a road was not just a path, it was a promise that Rome would endure. But even the strongest roads can fade. Rain eats stone. Empires crumble. And so, long after Rome fell silent, its roads remained. Skeletons of empire, still leading nowhere in particular, but refusing to disappear. And across the old world, from Persia to China, travelers continued to follow those invisible paths, the veins of forgotten civilizations. They carried silk, spices, salt, and letters. They carried news of births and wars. And in the hush of desert nights, they carried something else too. The quiet realization that every step forward was another hour lost to dust. Now, the world's roads were ready for their greatest transformation. A road that wasn't built of stone or sand, but of exchange. A road that would connect not just cities, but entire cultures, languages, and gods. It began with a single thread of silk and grew into the longest network the ancient world had ever known. But who first followed it? And what did the desert at dawn is neither gold nor red, where it is colorless. A silence so deep it seems to press against your ears. Then from far away the faint clinking of bells begins. Small bronze charms tied to the necks of camels, each one ringing softly in rhythm with the sand. A caravan is moving. They are traders, pilgrims, wanderers, a ribbon of humanity crossing the empty heart of Asia. On their backs are bundles wrapped in oiled silk, crates of dried tea leaves and jars of powdered jade. They will walk for months from the cities of China's Han Dynasty to the distant kingdoms of Bactria, Persia, and Rome. They are walking not a single road, but thousands of small trails that together form one vast idea: the Silk Road. It was never just one road. It was a web, a tangle of paths across deserts, rivers, and mountains. Its true genius wasn't in how it was built, but in how it connected. Where the royal road carried royal messages, the Silk Road carried everything else: ideas, religions, languages, diseases, art, spices, paper, music, and myths. Each footstep left a fragment of culture behind, and picked up another in exchange. The Silk Road began with something deceptively simple: trade. Around 200 BCE, the Han Dynasty sought new horses for their armies, stronger ones bred on the steppes far to the west. In return, they offered silk, a material so light and luminous that no one outside China knew how to make it. That thread of silk became the most desired substance in the known world. Romans called it sericum and whispered that it was woven from the hair of trees. A bolt of silk in Rome was worth its weight in gold, and senators, despite laws against it, wore thin silk robes beneath their togas for comfort. So merchants began to move. From China through Gansu, across the Taklamakan Desert, through Samarkand, Persia, and onto Antioch in the Mediterranean. Each leg of the journey changed hands dozens of times. But the silk never stopped moving, nor did the ideas that followed in its wake. The Silk Road became the first global information network, though no one called it that. Buddhism spread from India to China along its mountain passes. Paper traveled west from Chinese workshops, eventually changing the way Europe thought and wrote. Persian astronomers shared their star maps. Arab traders carried numbers that would become the digits we use today. The road was slow, but it remembered. Every town along the route was a translator's dream, languages mixing like rivers. A single inn might hear a dozen tongues in one night: Sogdian, Persian, Sanskrit, Greek, Aramaic, Chinese. And yet trade never stopped because of misunderstanding. The language of exchange, the gesture, the wait, the nod, was universal. In one dusty stopover near Dunhuang, Monks carved a small cave into a cliff and filled it with manuscripts. Over centuries, travelers left scrolls, letters, and fragments of prayers. When the cave was sealed, it held nearly 50,000 pieces of writing, the largest time capsule of the Silk Road. Among them were receipts for horse feed, letters from soldiers to their families, and even a note from a Chinese merchant asking a Persian partner to please send better quality glass next time. The road was sacred and mundane at once. Life along it was slow, perilous, and oddly peaceful. Caravans moved at the pace of trust, a few dozen kilometers per day. They navigated by stars, sand color, and the taste of the wind. When the moon was full, they walked at night, saving daylight for rest under makeshift tents. In deserts like the Taklamakan, the dunes swallowed entire caravans. Travelers told stories of hearing ghostly bells in the sand, echoes of lost traders who never made it through. And yet the next year others would try again. The Silk Road wasn't built by an empire. It wasn't ordered or paved. It simply happened because people wanted to connect. Where Rome's roads were statements of control, the Silk Road was an act of faith. It trusted strangers to pass goods, stories, and ideas from one hand to another across continents. No empire could own it. Every empire tried. But time has a way of eroding even the longest paths. By the 15th century, new technologies were emerging. Ships that could sail around Africa, compasses that pointed to invisible poles. The ocean became a faster road, and so the Silk Road began to fade. The caravanserais emptied, the bells quieted. Cities like Samarkand and Merv sank back into dust. The road fell silent, its stories buried beneath sand and forgotten towns. But perhaps the most curious thing about it is this. Though the Silk Road vanished, its idea never did. We still live by its rhythm. The endless trade, the exchange of information, the crossing of boundaries. Every package that ships overseas, every message sent across the world in an instant, is a descendant of that same long patience, the rhythm of the camel's steps through the desert. And so we are left with a strange question. In our age of speed and signal, where every second counts, have we truly moved faster than those slow caravans? Or have we simply forgotten what it felt like to travel through time? One step, one trade. The road always ends the same way, not with a wall or a city, but with silence. Somewhere in Central Asia, in the shadow of old caravan ruins, wind curls through empty archways that once echoed with the clatter of hooves and laughter. A lone stone marker leans half-buried in sand. No words remain on it, only grooves worn smooth by centuries of touch. The Silk Road has vanished, and yet it has never really gone, because when a road disappears, its memory doesn't. It lingers not in maps, but in the things that still move. Long after the last caravans were gone, the patterns they carved through the world remained. Markets still appeared at the same intervals. Cities that once welcomed traders continued to live by the rhythm of arrival and departure. Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar. Their streets still follow the invisible geometry of those ancient routes. Even the merchants who sold spices and cloth continued to price their goods as though they had traveled from across the world, because once they had. The road had become an idea, woven into economies, habits, and dreams. By the 1500s, the ocean had stolen the future. Portuguese caravels and Arab dhows sailed routes faster and cheaper than any camel's pace. For the first time in history, the world was connected not by land but by water. And so the slow roads fell out of memory. Dust covered the milestones and the inns collapsed into piles of brick. But the truth is, every sailor who looked at a map of the Indian Ocean was still following an echo of the Silk Road, just on waves instead of sand. And yet, some roads never stopped breathing. In the mountains of Afghanistan, tiny villages still trade salt for grain as their ancestors did. In the markets of Xi'an, you can still buy dried figs from Iran and lapis lazuli from mines that once supplied Egyptian temples. Even in Venice, the glassmakers who once melted sand from Syria still call their best work Cristallo, a memory of trade carried by camel and handcart 1,000 years ago. So much of human civilization was built on the quiet repetition of footsteps. Before wheels turned or engines roared, we shaped the world with our walking. Roads are not only about movement, they are about return. Every traveler who left home to trade, fight, or explore carried something of home with them and brought something foreign back. That slow exchange changed humanity more than any invention or because every road, no matter how far, was really a bridge between strangers. But the most fascinating thing about these forgotten roads is how they taught people to think in rhythm, not speed. A caravan learned patience from the desert, a messenger learned humility from distance, and every empire learned, and often too late, that you can build a road across the world, but you cannot walk it forever. Empires fall. Dust reclaims stone. But the human desire to connect, to send, to share, to reach, always finds a new path. In the 21st century, we speak again of the New Silk Road, a network of railways, highways, and digital cables linking Asia, Europe, and Africa. We call it progress, but in truth it is an echo, a return to the oldest dream we ever had, to touch another world by moving through our own. And perhaps, if you listen closely beneath the rumble of modern trucks and the hum of fiber optic lines, you can still hear the soft ringing of camel bells, marking the rhythm of an ancient heartbeat. In the end, every road leads not to a city, but to understanding. The world we walk today, paved, mapped, connected, was built upon the backs of those who moved slowly, trusting the road, the wind, and one another. They measured life not in miles, but in moments shared between departures and arrivals. And maybe that's why these old paths still haunt us, because they remind us that connection doesn't come from speed. It comes from journey. The wind picks up again across the dunes. A few faint tracks vanish beneath the shifting sand. The desert forgets, as it always does. But the road, the real one, the invisible one between you and the rest of the world, is still there, waiting to be walked. Before sand ran through glass, before gears and bells, time was measured by water. Long before anyone could wind a clock or hear a chime, people watched the world drip, one drop at a time. It sounds dull, and it was, but in that dullness, something astonishing began. Because to watch water fall slowly through the hours is to watch civilization itself learn rhythm. Our story begins not in one place, but in many. Almost every ancient culture, Egypt, Babylon, China, India, and Greece, discovered the same quiet truth. If you let water escape slowly from one vessel into another, you can measure time. It seems almost too simple. A pot with a hole, a bowl filling below. When the bowl was full, an hour had passed, and yet this humble device, the clepsydra, or water thief, was one of the most important inventions in history. The Egyptians used it first around 1500 BCE. Their nights were long and their skies full of gods. Priests in Thebes watching the stars from temple roofs needed a way to know when to begin the next ritual. So they built stone jars with narrow holes and etched lines along the inside walls to mark the hours. Each hour, the water level dropped a little. Each drop, a heartbeat of the heavens. These were the world's first steady clocks, silent, reliable, and as patient as the Nile itself. It wasn't glamorous work, keeping a water clock. A temple attendant had to refill the jar by hand. He had to adjust for temperature and humidity, Because cold water flowed slower than warm, he had to wake before dawn, staring at the faint shimmer of moonlight on the rim of the jar, listening to the faint trickle that told him time was moving. But that was what made it sacred. Time was no longer an abstract thing. It was a physical sound. A sound of devotion, almost like breathing. The Babylonians took the idea further. They built water clocks not for prayer, but for power. In their courts, officials used clepsydra to measure how long petitions lasted, how long speeches were allowed, and even how long the king's justice should be dispensed. It was bureaucracy by the drop. If a man's case took too long, the water ran out and the case was dismissed. Efficiency, it seems, was already an ancient obsession. By 500 BCE, the Greeks had inherited the water clock and given it elegance. They used it in law courts and assemblies, where a bronze bowl slowly filled as orators spoke. When the water reached a line, the speech was over. No exceptions. Philosophers like Aristotle and Demosthenes literally spoke against the clock. It's a strange thought. Democracy powered by dripping water. The Greeks also used the clepsydra in their workshops. Archimedes designed elaborate devices with multiple chambers, spouts, and floats that rose as the water fell. A primitive but effective feedback system. Some could even ring bells or move small statues at the turn of the hour. And so, drop by drop, the water clock became not just a timer, but a machine. Meanwhile, far to the east, the Chinese were developing their own version. As early as the Zhou dynasty, they built bronze water clocks with carefully calibrated holes and floating indicators. By the time of the Tang and Song dynasties, these designs had evolved into full hydraulic towers. Massive, intricate devices that used wheels, gears, and dripping tanks to track both time and the heavens. One of them, Zhang Heng's 2nd century water armillary sphere, even rotated automatically with the movement of the stars. It was part clock, part planetarium, part meditation. The world's first mechanical computers began not with gears, but with water. But the true beauty of the water clock was its slowness. It didn't hurry. It didn't tick or clang. It flowed like life itself, steady, indifferent, unstoppable. To ancient people, this was not a flaw. It was wisdom. A good life, like a good clock, should move evenly. Never rushing, never pausing, always balanced. In their own quiet way, these early clocks taught the world something profound. That time wasn't meant to be owned, only observed. And so, across temples, courts, and palaces, the sound of dripping water became the pulse of civilization. The priests timed their prayers. The astronomers timed their stars. The judges timed their speeches. All because somewhere in the dark a bowl was filling slowly, and a small ripple told them that another hour had passed. But there was one problem. A simple flaw that would drive engineers for centuries to come. Water doesn't flow the same way every day. It changes with temperature, pressure, and shape. If you wanted a truly accurate clock, you would have to find a way to control nature itself, to make time flow perfectly, drop for drop. And so, from this quiet beginning, from clay pots and stone jars, a new age of invention would rise. One where humans tried not just to When water began to tell time, it did more than divide the hours. It started to divide civilizations. Those who mastered the steady drip of time gained control. Control over labor, over religion, over ritual, over empire. The next stage of the water clock's evolution was not about invention, but about refinement. And refinement, as the ancient engineers soon discovered, is the most boring and most essential part of history. Let us begin in Ptolemaic Egypt, around the 3rd century BCE. The temples of Horus and Amun had by then turned the clepsydra from a simple jar into a precisely carved instrument. They used polished stone, sometimes alabaster or basalt, and made the holes so fine that you could barely see them. The Egyptians even corrected for the seasons. Because daylight hours were longer in summer and shorter in winter, the interior of the clock was shaped like a cone, wide at the top, narrow at the bottom, so that the water's flow matched the changing length of the day. Each month had its own set of markings, engraved in neat little columns on the inside. A year of timekeeping hidden inside a single pot. It must have taken months to carve one and years to learn how to read it properly. Around the same time, the Greeks continued their own experiments. In the workshops of Alexandria, that melting pot of Egyptian patience and Greek curiosity, engineers were building contraptions that would make even modern watchmakers smile. One of the most remarkable was designed by Ctesibius, a Greek inventor sometimes called the father of pneumatics. Ctesibius noticed that water clocks could not stay accurate for long. As the level of water in the upper container dropped, the pressure weakened and the flow slowed down. So he built a new version, one that used a constant level tank and a float regulator. It was a system centuries ahead of its time, a water clock that self-corrected, and he didn't stop there. Ctesibius added little gears, dials, and even mechanical figures. Tiny doors opened when hours passed. A bird chirped. A statue moved its arm. It was the world's first automaton clock. Imagine that 2,000 years ago, in a workshop filled with the smell of oil and wet bronze, a machine that measured time with precision and put on a show. Meanwhile, in faraway China, the same quest was taking a far grander shape. In 1088 CE, an engineer named Su Song built one of the most extraordinary machines in history, the cosmic engine. It was a towering structure of bronze and wood, nearly 30 feet high, driven entirely by water. At its heart was an escapement mechanism, a system that controlled the release of energy so that each drop of water powered a precise, rhythmic motion. This was, in essence, the ancestor of every modern clock. But Su Song's machine did more than tell time. It modeled the movement of the stars. Gears turned celestial spheres. Doors opened to reveal figures of scholars. Bells rang every quarter hour. It was not just a timekeeper. It was a miniature universe, running quietly in the corner of the Imperial Observatory, and perhaps most remarkable of all, it was accurate. In the Middle East, meanwhile, the tradition of the water clock became a symbol of learning itself. During the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad's House of Wisdom hosted scholars who studied and improved upon the ancient Greek and Persian designs. The Banu Musa brothers, early scientists of the 9th century, wrote treatises describing dozens of water-powered devices, musical fountains, automatic pitchers, and complex timing mechanisms. A century later, Al-Jazari, chief engineer of the Artukid court in Diyarbakir, perfected the art of the water automaton. His most famous creation, the elephant clock, was a masterpiece of cultural symbolism. It featured an Indian elephant, an Egyptian phoenix, Greek columns, and a Chinese dragon, all working together to mark the passage of time. Inside the elephant, a hidden water system powered floating figures, metal birds, and little balls that dropped from the dragon's mouth into the palace's golden bowl. Every half hour, the entire contraption came alive, and all of it, every movement, every sound came from a single bowl of dripping water. But behind the wonder was something even more powerful: control. The rulers who owned these clocks weren't just measuring time, they were owning it. A clock that worked perfectly symbolized divine order and righteous rule. It meant that even nature obeyed the king. So when a foreign ambassador visited Baghdad, the caliph would not show him gold or armies. He would show him a water clock, a device that counted every second, steady and obedient, a quiet declaration that this empire had tamed the very flow of time. By the 13th century, water clocks had reached their mechanical peak. They could strike bells, move statues, and display celestial charts. But they still suffered the same flaw that had haunted them from the beginning: imperfection. No matter how skilled the craftsman, water changed with the weather. Evaporation, viscosity, temperature, each conspired against accuracy. The same drops that once defined civilization were now its limitation. Something more precise was needed, something that would not flow but swing, and so quietly, the age of water began to give way to the age of metal and gears. The monks of medieval Europe, in their chilly stone abbeys, began experimenting with new kinds of clocks, machines driven not by water, but by weights and escapements. Their goal was simple: to keep the divine hours perfectly. The result would be the first mechanical clocks, and the slow death of the clepsydra. Yet even as the water clock faded, its influence never truly disappeared. The very idea of a steady, measured mechanical rhythm that came from the way water once dripped through a temple jar. In that sense, every modern watch and digital timer still carries a memory of those ancient pots, still echoes that slow, sacred sound of dripping water. But before we move on to the ticking clocks of Europe, there remains one final chapter in this long, quiet saga, a story not about invention, but about meaning. What did all this careful measuring really give us? And what did, by the time Europe awoke from the long twilight of the Middle Ages, the steady drip of water had already grown faint. Yet its echo lingered in the stone monasteries, in the quiet minds of monks who still rose before dawn to mark the passing of sacred hours. They needed accuracy, more than ever. Prayers at sunrise, psalms at noon, vigils at midnight. The rhythm of devotion depended on precision. But the old clepsydrae, faithful as they were, could not keep pace with winter frost and summer warmth. Water froze. Water evaporated. Time itself slipped through the cracks. So the monks began tinkering with weights, pulleys, and wheels. In that silence, the first mechanical escapements were born. Machines that clicked rather than dripped. It was a quiet revolution. And like all great revolutions, it began not with noise but with boredom. Imagine a small monastery in 13th century England. Stone walls slick with damp, candles guttering in narrow alcoves, the faint scent of oil and beeswax. A monk leans over a table, watching an iron wheel turn one notch at a time. He listens, click, click, click. It is the sound of perfection. Not water, not wind, but pure mechanical rhythm. The first true clocks were not built for cities or kings. They were built for prayer. Each tick was an act of worship, each swing of the escapement a breath in a monastic hymn. And yet, quietly, something shifted. Time, once sacred, fluid, and seasonal, was becoming mechanical. In the centuries that followed, the art of clockmaking spread across Europe like wildfire. Church towers sprouted gears and bells. Public squares filled with mechanical marvels that marked the hours with metallic song. By the 15th century, people no longer looked at the sun or listened to dripping water. They looked up to the clock tower and waited for its chime. The world had found a new rhythm, a rhythm of minutes, of schedules, of work. The gentle flow of water had become the rigid tick of iron, and so, water clocks slipped into obscurity. The clepsydrae were left to gather dust in temples and ruins, their stone markings fading under centuries of neglect. By the time explorers crossed oceans and scientists began measuring atoms, the old dripping jars seemed almost laughably primitive. They were relics of a slower, simpler humanity. But were they really just primitive? Or were they wiser than the machines that replaced them? Because when time became mechanical, it also became relentless. There was no longer room for drift, for stillness, for the small human error that once reminded us we were alive. Think about it. The water clock moved with the seasons. It slowed in the cold, it quickened in the heat, just like people did. Its rhythm was imperfect but organic. Its patience matched the rhythm of life itself. The modern clock, by contrast, knows no weather, no feeling, no pause. It beats without mercy, measuring our days in identical strokes. The water clock let time breathe. The metal clock began to command it, and yet, there is still something deeply beautiful about that first humble invention. The idea that someone, thousands of years ago in a quiet temple by the Nile or a dim workshop in Babylon, could sit and simply watch waterfall and in that act, understand time, that remains a kind of miracle. Those ancient jars, those slow, patient drips, taught us the art of waiting, the dignity of rhythm, and the understanding that life, like time, can only be measured if we're willing to observe it quietly. So perhaps the story of the water clock isn't just about invention. Perhaps it's about humility, a reminder that before we conquered time, we first had to listen to it, to hear it fall, to feel it pass, to let it flow. And though today we wear time on our wrists and wake to digital alarms, somewhere deep down, our sense of time still flows like water. Not in ticks and talks, but in moments that ripple, merge. Before the hum of typewriters, before keyboards and printing presses, there were scribes. Men, and sometimes women, who spent their entire lives sitting in still rooms, bending over sheets of papyrus, parchment, or palm leaf, recording the smallest fragments of human existence. They did not fight wars. They did not rule empires, and yet without them, empires would have simply dissolved into dust. They were the recorders of everything. Grain harvests, birth rolls, taxes, temple offerings, treaties, love letters, punishments, and prayers. They lived in the spaces between great events, where history becomes handwriting. The world's first scribes appeared around 3200 BCE in the river valleys of Mesopotamia. It began with something deceptively dull, accounting. Farmers and traders needed to keep track of grain, goats, and silver. To do so, they pressed tiny marks into soft clay tablets, symbols that represented numbers, names, and goods. It was tedious work. Day after day, sitting by the riverbank, a reed stylus in hand, pressing the same wedge-shaped marks into tablet after tablet. Yet from those marks came the first written language, cuneiform. The first words ever written were not poems or laws, but lists, inventories, receipts. The world's oldest surviving document is not a story. It's an invoice. The scribes of Sumer worked in small offices called edubas, tablet houses. There, young apprentices spent years memorizing thousands of symbols. They learned to write with precision, their teachers standing over them with whips made of reed stalks. Mistakes were not tolerated. A single wrong mark could turn 10 oxen into 1 ox, and someone, somewhere, would be punished for it. But in return for their discipline, scribes were given something rare in the ancient world: power. They were literate in an age when kings sometimes weren't. They could interpret the language of gods and laws, and that made them indispensable. In Egypt, scribes were even more revered. They worked not just for officials, but for eternity. Their records lined tombs and temples, and their hieroglyphs were thought to hold divine force. A scribe's pen was sacred, a tool that could preserve a soul forever. One ancient Egyptian text, "The immortality of writers," reads, "Man perishes. His corpse turns to dust, but writings make him remembered in the mouth of the reader." To be a scribe was to defeat death. one careful symbol at a time. Life as a scribe, however, was not glamorous. Most days began before sunrise. They worked by oil lamps, sitting cross-legged for hours, their backs bent, their fingers stained black with soot and gum ink. They copied the same prayers and laws again and again, making thousands of perfect duplicates by hand. The papyrus sheets had to be smoothed, dried, trimmed, and bound. Ink was mixed fresh every morning, a slow ritual of grinding and stirring, until it was just thick enough to flow smoothly across the fibers. Each mistake had to be carefully scraped off with a bronze blade, then polished over again, a process that could take half an hour for a single word. And yet, they persisted, because they knew something no one else did. Every great idea, every law, every poem only mattered if someone wrote it down. The scribes were the memory of their civilization. In Mesopotamia, they preserved royal decrees for centuries. In Egypt, they copied the Book of the Dead so souls could navigate the afterlife. In China, imperial clerks recorded every event, from eclipses to crop yields, with exhausting precision. A single line from the records of the Grand Historian, written by Sima Qian around 90 BCE, might describe something as small as the quality of wheat in one province, or as grand as the fall of an entire dynasty. The scale didn't matter. To a scribe, all information was sacred. Even when empires fell, scribes endured. When armies burned libraries, scribes hid scrolls in jars. When kings changed, they simply began new ledgers with new names. They were loyal not to rulers, but to record-keeping itself. And there's something almost hypnotic about imagining their days. The rhythmic scratch of reeds, the faint smell of ink, the murmur of dictation from another room. Outside, perhaps, a city growing louder and markets, soldiers, and merchants passing by, but inside only the soft, endless rustle of paper. That sound was civilization breathing. Yet for all their quiet importance, scribes lived fragile lives. They worked in dim light, suffered eye strain, cramped hands, and aching spines. Their world was as small as the width of a scroll. And yet, through that narrow window, they saw eternity. Over time, writing systems grew simpler. Phoenicians introduced alphabets, Greeks added vowels, Romans made letters march in perfect lines. Each reform made writing faster, easier, but also less sacred. As more people learned to write, the scribe's monopoly on memory began to fade. And somewhere deep within the world's archives, a quiet anxiety began to stir, because if everyone could write, what would become of the ones who had built their lives on being the only ones who could? The ink dried, the scrolls multiplied, and the world of the scribes began to change forever. But not yet. For now the reed still scratched, the ink still flowed, and the record of the world, line after line. If you ever wanted to understand how an empire really worked, you would not look to its generals or its kings. You would look to its scribes, the quiet bureaucrats who turned chaos into order, and memory into law. Because the true strength of any civilization was not how much land it conquered, but how much it could record. By the 6th century BCE, scribes had become the invisible architecture of empires. In Babylon, they kept astronomical logs that predicted eclipses with astonishing precision. In Persia, they managed vast systems of taxation, recording the movements of grain, horses, and soldiers across thousands of miles of desert. And in Egypt, scribes working for the pharaoh's treasury counted every sack of barley, every shipment of limestone, every worker in every quarry. The pharaoh may have ruled in name, but the scribe ruled in detail. Every transaction, every harvest, every punishment, all of it passed through the reed pens of these clerks. Their offices were filled with shelves stacked high with scrolls, records of records, lists of lists, each one carefully labeled and sealed. In many ways, they built the first databases, long before computers, long before ledgers were ever called books. Theirs was a world of endless repetition. Copying, checking, filing, cross-referencing. It was slow work, and most of it was as dull as drying ink. But it worked. An empire's memory was made of patience. In ancient China, scribes were perhaps the most important class of all. During the Zhou and Han dynasties, a single record keeper might spend his entire life maintaining one aspect of the emperor's administration: grain taxes, irrigation systems, or the breeding of horses. These men were called shi, scholar officials. To become one, you had to pass the imperial examinations, tests so difficult they could take decades to master. They required knowledge of history, philosophy, poetry, and law, and the ability to write with beauty and precision. To fail meant disgrace. To pass meant immortality in the archives. Imagine for a moment one of them, a clerk in a vast palace hall in Chang'an, sitting beneath silk banners and red lacquer beams. Before him, rows of bamboo slips tied with string. A brazier burns faintly in the corner. His inkstone gleams darkly in the light of the morning sun. He dips his brush into the ink, presses it lightly to the first slip, and begins to write. The yield of millet in the southern fields is lower by 7 measures than last year. It is not poetry. It is not philosophy, but it is permanence. Centuries later, someone will read those same words and know exactly how the fields once fared. The scribe's small gesture has become a bridge across time. The same quiet labor unfolded across the world. In Greece, clerks known as grammatius recorded decrees and civic votes, etching them into marble for permanence. In Rome, entire offices, the tabularium, were filled with public records, citizenship rolls, military rosters, legal rulings. And when the Roman Empire spread across Europe, its scribes carried with them not just ink and parchment, but the habit of writing down everything: taxes, marriages, disputes, even weather reports. Rome ran not just on legions, but on ledgers. But perhaps the most fascinating scribes of all lived in a place where writing itself looked like art. In the golden libraries of Baghdad and Cordoba, during the height of the Islamic Golden Age, scribes known as katibs preserved and translated the knowledge of Greece, Persia, and India. Their work was delicate, almost devotional. They copied manuscripts in black and gold ink, each line perfectly aligned, each margin balanced like a geometric pattern. They wrote philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and through their pens the wisdom of the ancient world was carried forward, line by line, into the modern age. Without them, Aristotle would have vanished. Without them, algebra would have been forgotten. Without them, the Renaissance might never have begun. What's most remarkable, though, is how similar all these scribes were, across thousands of years and continents. Their tools changed, from clay to papyrus, from quill to brush, but their rhythm never did. Dip, press, lift, dry, repeat. They all worked in silence. They all lived by precision, and they all believed that words, and carefully recorded, could keep the world from slipping into chaos. In their hands, history itself became a kind of machinery, a slow grinding, human machine that transformed fleeting speech into lasting law. Every empire, every dynasty, every ruler on it was kept alive through the endurance of its scribes. And yet, even as their pens shaped the ages, something subtle began to change. The act of writing, once sacred, was becoming a profession. A job. The scribe was no longer a priest or philosopher. He was an employee, a function, and when the printing press arrived, that function would soon vanish altogether. But before the ink dries forever, before the scratch of pens is replaced by the clatter of type, there is one last chapter to tell. a final glimpse into what it felt like when the scribes realized that their world was ending. There is a quiet kind of tragedy in watching your own importance fade. For nearly 4,000 years, scribes had been the keepers of civilization's heartbeat. Every law, every trade, every life counted and copied by their hands. And then, one invention, one small mechanical wonder, undid it all. The printing press. When Johannes Gutenberg assembled his press in the 1440s, he could not have known that his device would end an era older than history itself. The invention was elegant in its simplicity. Movable metal letters pressed ink onto paper. No more clay, no more quills worn down to splinters. No more sleepless nights copying the same line 100 times. For the first time, words could multiply without human hands. The scribes, who once believed that no civilization could survive without them, watched as books began to appear faster than they could be written. What had taken a lifetime to copy could now be printed in a day. And with that speed came something else. A shift in who owned knowledge. Before the press, only a handful of men could write, and fewer still could read. Knowledge was not just power, it was property, locked away in monasteries, palaces, and tax offices. But now, printers' workshops hummed across Europe like 1,000 small engines of democracy. Every pamphlet, every translation, every crude little booklet carried the potential to change a mind or start a revolution. A monk in Mainz might still be writing by candlelight, but a printer in Venice could flood the city with ideas before the ink even dried. The scribe's slow, careful world was dissolving into ink and noise. Some resisted. In 1470, scribes at the University of Paris petitioned against the use of printed books. They claimed the press produced imperfect letters and errors unworthy of scholars. They were right in a way. Early printed texts were riddled with mistakes, but speed had won. And once the presses began to churn, there was no going back. By 1500, more than 20 million books had been printed in Europe. More books than the combined total of all manuscripts copied by scribes in the previous 1,000 years. The quiet world of the pen was drowned in a flood of words, yet not all was lost. In their final centuries, the scribes turned inward. They began to see their craft not as a profession, but as an art. Calligraphy became devotion. The illuminated manuscripts of the 15th century, their letters lined with gold and lapis lazuli, were not made to store information anymore. They were made to honor it. Monks and scholars produced Bibles and psalters so beautiful they seemed to glow from within. Each page whispered, "We may be fading, but beauty still belongs to the hand." And in other corners of the world, where the press had not yet reached, the scribes held on a little longer. In Persia, royal calligraphers continued their delicate work for centuries, writing entire poems in the curve of a single letter. In India, record keepers known as patwaris filled ledgers by hand until the 19th century. And in Japan, temple scribes still trace sutras by brush and ink, a living prayer through repetition. Even now, in certain monasteries and archives, you can still hear the faint scratching of pens on paper, an echo of the world before print. But perhaps the strangest part of the story is that the scribes did not truly disappear. They simply changed shape. When printing spread, it created a new class of record keepers, clerks, typists, editors, bureaucrats. Men and women whose work was to manage paper, not parchment. They were the heirs of the scribes, though few of them ever realized it. The form of their tools changed. Pens became typewriters, typewriters became keyboards, and now even keyboards fade into voice and screen. But the instinct to record, to preserve, to order the world through words, never left us. You can see their legacy everywhere, in the neat columns of a spreadsheet, In the metadata of a digital archive, in the endless quiet labor of people who keep information tidy and true, every time you write a list, or file a report or name a document just to find it later, you are performing a ritual thousands of years old, the ritual of the scribe. So perhaps the pens did not fall silent after all. Perhaps they only changed their sound. The whisper of ink became the hum of machines, and now the soft click of keys. But the purpose ought to keep memory alive, to make the fleeting permanent, remains the same. And as long as we write, in any form at all, the scribal empire endures. Next time you pick up a pen, or open a blank page on a screen, remember, you are not alone. You are part of a lineage older than kings, older than history itself. A quiet chain. It begins, as most stories do, with frustration. A man sits alone at a desk covered in paper. The year is 1821, and his name is Charles Babbage. He is surrounded by numbers, long columns of them, figures copied and recalculated again and again by tired human hands. These are tables of navigation, interest rates, astronomical charts, the foundations of 19th century science and trade. And they are full of errors. Each mistake could cost lives at sea or fortunes in commerce. Babbage stares at the columns and mutters, almost to himself, "I wish to God these calculations had been executed by steam." It sounds like a joke, but it isn't. In that small burst of irritation, the idea of the computer is born. For centuries, humans had been their own machines. The scribes of Babylon, the monks of Oxford, the merchants of Venice, all turning words and numbers into order by hand. But as trade and science grew more complex, the limits of flesh and ink began to show. A man could copy 1,000 words a day. A woman could check a column of numbers in an hour. But a nation of machines could do 1,000,000 more. Without sleep, without error, without boredom, the age of human calculation was ending. The age of mechanical thought was about to begin. Babbage's first invention, the difference engine, was a masterpiece of brass and patience. It looked like an enormous clock, the gears, shafts, levers, and rotating drums, each one designed to compute mathematical tables automatically. If finished, it would have been able to print perfect logarithms and trigonometric values, without a single human hand touching a pen. But "if" is the word that haunted Babbage. The machine was too ambitious, too expensive. It consumed government grants and decades of work. The parts were machined by hand, the funding fell apart, and the engine remained unfinished, a dream of logic buried under piles of metal. Yet even in failure, it changed the world. In the 1830s, Babbage sketched a new design, the analytical engine. Unlike the difference engine, this one could not just calculate. It could decide what to calculate next. It used punch cards, loops, memory units, and a mill for processing. In essence, it was the first description of a modern programmable computer. But the most remarkable part of the story was not Babbage himself, but the woman who understood him better than anyone else, Ada Lovelace. Ada was a mathematician, the daughter of the poet Lord Byron, and one of the few people of her time who saw what Babbage's machine truly represented. While others thought of it as a glorified calculator, Ada saw a glimpse of something more. She wrote, "The analytical engine weaves algebraic patterns, just as the jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves." She believed that one day, machines like Babbage's could create not just numbers, but music, art, and thought. Her notes on the analytical engine included what many historians now call the world's first computer program, a sequence of instructions meant to tell a machine how to think. Of course, no machine was ever built in her lifetime. The world wasn't ready. The technology, the precision engineering, the politics, None of it existed yet. But ideas have a way of waiting, and sometimes they wait for centuries. The 19th century ended and the world filled with smoke, steam, and steel. Factories grew louder, trains grew faster, and wars became mathematical problems to be solved. By the early 20th century, machines were counting faster than men again. Tabulators, adding machines, punch card sorters. The scribes had given way to typists, and the typists were now giving way to operators. Each machine was a fragment of Babbage's dream, and yet none could do what his engines had promised, to think. Still, deep inside the mechanical whirring, there was the faint sound of possibility, the same quiet rhythm that once belonged to the quill and the inkstone, now echoed in the turning of gears and the clatter of levers. Humanity had built a new kind of scribe, a mechanical one. It could not dream or feel, but it could remember and repeat, and that perhaps was the beginning of a different kind of memory. But the question remained, if machines could think for us, what would happen to the patience, the slowness, the quiet observation that once defined our human craft? Could a machine ever hold the stillness that a scribe once found in the sound of ink drying? Could numbers ever whisper like parchment once did? Or were we, in our rush to automate, building not just calculators, but replacements for our own reflection? The gears are still turning in Babbage's workshop, though he and Ada are long gone. Their unfinished dreams still hum faintly in every processor, every algorithm, every gentle pulse of data. The world of thought is changing again, and as it does, we might ask the same question Babbage once whispered to himself. What happens when the machine begins to remember everything? The year is 1936. Europe is uneasy. Empires have begun to tremble again, and once more, the fate of nations will rest on how fast men can think, or how fast their machines can. A young mathematician named Alan Turing walks alone through the halls of Cambridge. He is shy, awkward, often lost in thought. But in his mind, something extraordinary is forming, an idea so abstract and powerful that it will reshape the entire human relationship with information. Turing imagines a hypothetical machine, a device that can read instructions, perform logic, and change its own behavior based on what it reads. It has a tape, a head that moves left or right, and a set of rules to follow. It exists only in thought, yet it can simulate any calculation. He calls it the universal machine. We call it the computer. Turing doesn't know it yet, but his abstract daydream will soon collide with the most brutal reality imaginable: war. When the Second World War breaks out, Britain is desperate to break the encrypted messages of the German military. They are produced by a machine called the Enigma, a device of spinning rotors that changes its cipher with every key press. The code seems unbreakable, but at Bletchley Park, a secret estate north of London, Turing and a small team of mathematicians, engineers, and linguists begin their quiet war against it. The work is monotonous, repetitive, the kind of labor that would drive most people mad. But not Turing. He builds a new kind of machine, a mechanical brain designed to think faster than any human mind could. It is called the bomb, a vast humming structure of rotors and wires. It tests millions of possible combinations, searching for the key that unlocks the enemy's code. Hour after hour, day after day, it spins and clicks, decoding the whispers of war. Turing and his team shorten the conflict by years, saving millions of lives, and all through logic, patience, and gears. The world would never know. Their work remained secret for decades, but in those hidden rooms, the age of electronic intelligence truly began. When the war ended, a strange kind of silence followed. For the first time, humanity had built machines that could perform more calculations in a second than a human could in a lifetime. The ENIAC, in America, was one of the first fully electronic computers, a room-sized cathedral of wires and vacuum tubes. It could calculate artillery trajectories, weather patterns, and atomic data. It glowed like a furnace, humming with power and potential. And standing beside it were not generals or soldiers, but women. They were called computers before the machines were. Brilliant mathematicians, often overlooked by history. Joan Bartek, Kathleen McNulty, Francis Spence, and others were the first programmers, writing instructions by hand, feeding them into the machine through switches and cables. They turned mathematics into language. They told the computer what to think, and in doing so they became the new generation of scribes. Their pens were gone. Their logic was their ink. Every calculation, every routine, every line of code was written with the same devotion that monks once gave to copying sacred texts. But something curious began to happen as the machines grew smaller and smarter. The human scribes, the programmers, began to wonder what exactly their creations were. Were they tools or something more? When a program began to behave unexpectedly, was it merely an error or a glimpse of autonomy? Could a machine that followed rules ever step beyond them? In 1950, Turing posed a question so haunting that we still wrestle with it today. Can machines think? He proposed a test, the imitation game, in which a human and a machine would both answer questions, and if an observer couldn't tell which was which, then the machine could be said to think. It was not a question of wires or electricity. It was a question of soul. And quietly, Turing predicted that one day machines would not just calculate, they would converse. They would learn. They would even dream. He did not live to see it. In 1954, after persecution and disgrace, Alan Turing took his own life. His code-breaking work remained classified. His name nearly forgotten, but machines remembered. His theories lived on inside every circuit, every algorithm, every whisper of artificial thought. By the mid-20th century, the world was filling again with the hum of new scribes, not made of flesh or parchment, but of electricity and logic. From vacuum tubes to transistors, from transistors to silicon chips, the pattern was the same. Memory, language, order, the rhythm of the scribe, repeated in metal. And as the machines learned to read data and store it, humanity began to record more than ever before. Every message, every transaction, every heartbeat, the archives of the ancient world had once been measured in scrolls. Now they were measured in terabytes. The quiet clerk had become the global server, and just like the scribes of Babylon, our new mechanical assistants were learning not only to remember, but to predict. Yet even now, a question lingers in the hum of every processor. When a machine completes your sentence, or remembers a face you forgot, is it simply doing its job? Or has it, in some faint and ghostly way, begun to understand you? We have built a world that writes itself, a world where memory is infinite but attention is fleeting. The scribe no longer holds a pen. The machine no longer waits for orders. They work together, unblinking, unstoppable. Two halves of the same ancient impulse to record, to preserve, to know. And somewhere in the endless hum of data centers and server farms, perhaps Babbage and Turing would smile. The dream of the mechanical scribe is alive, but what happens when the dream begins to dream back? The world has grown loud. There are no more quills, no more parchment rolls, no clattering typewriters. Only the soft tap of fingers on glass and the silent hum of devices that never sleep. Every second, billions of machines speak to one another, in languages no human truly understands. They record births and deaths, songs and secrets, wars and grocery lists. For the first time in history, the sum of what we know is no longer in our heads or in our books. It lives elsewhere. It lives inside the machine. The dream that began with Charles Babbage's gears and Ada Lovelace's ink-stained notes has become something vast, borderless and alive. We call it the internet, but perhaps it deserves an older name. Something closer to the archive of all things, because that is what it is now. An endless, sprawling library where every human moment leaves a trace. From the humblest email to the largest telescope image, it all gathers there, layer upon layer, a living fossil record of thought. The modern scribes no longer work in candlelight. They sit before glowing screens, their faces reflected in blue light instead of flame. Some write code that keeps cities running. Some analyze data from distant planets. Some simply write stories, as humans have always done, but all of them, knowingly or not, are continuing the same ancient tradition to remember the world before it forgets itself. In data centers, rows upon rows of black machines blink quietly in the dark. Each one holds 1,000,000 small fragments of human memory. Your voice, your photograph, your search, your laughter. If a clay tablet once held a king's decree, these machines hold the dreams of billions. And unlike parchment, they never decay, or so we tell ourselves, because even now, the scribe's greatest lesson still applies. Nothing lasts forever. Clay crumbles. Papyrus fades. Hard drives fail. Servers rust. And the light, no matter how bright, always dims in the end. For every age that believed it had conquered time, the truth has remained the same. Memory must be renewed, or it will vanish. The machine remembers, yes, but only as long as someone still cares to keep it running. Somewhere in a university basement, a server hums quietly, its fans coated with dust. It stores the files of a forgotten research project from 2002. No one has accessed them in years, yet the data is still there, waiting, sleeping like a message in a bottle. Perhaps that is what the new scribes are. Not writers, not engineers, but caretakers of sleeping memory. And so the story circles back, from the first scratch of a reed pen on clay to the hum of processors beneath mountains. We have always built tools to hold what we fear to lose. Our memories, our names, our meaning. Every age believes it invented permanence. Every age forgets that permanence is an illusion. But in trying, in reaching, in recording, we give shape to the chaos. We build something close to eternity. In a way, perhaps the machines have already surpassed us. They remember more than we can. They do not tire or sleep or doubt, and yet, for all their brilliance, they still cannot feel the weight of history, the ache of time pressing gently behind each word. Only we can do that. It is why the stories matter. It is why the past still hums softly beneath the noise of progress. So when you close your eyes tonight, and the world fades into quiet static, remember this. The ink may change, the parchment may vanish, but the act of remembering, of telling and retelling, never dies. From the clay tablets of Sumer to the circuits of silicon, it is all one long sentence, still being written, and so our long, quiet journey through history comes to an end. From the first ticking water clocks to the humming servers of today, we've always searched for ways to remember our place in time. Maybe that's all history really is. A soft echo reminding us that nothing is ever truly lost. So rest now. Let the past keep watch while you sleep. Good night, and thank you for listening.